Okay, in this video, we're going to take a look at the International Monetary System, Chapter 2 in the textbook, and we'll start with looking at different monetary systems or different regimes that have happened over time. We've kind of classified these into a few different time periods. The only thing I really want you to know is basically what's on the sheet. You don't have to know all of the details, but just some kind of high points for each of these regimes. The first one being the regime of bimetallism. So prior to 1875, we had gold and silver being used in coins. So those are the two metals, the bimetallism. And then the key idea here is that exchange rates were determined by the gold or the silver content and the value of gold in relation to silver. So the exchange rates between metals determined how much the exchange rate was between countries, and it was typically fixed based on the value of gold and silver. So for instance, let's say the British pound was equal to 1/10 of an ounce of gold, and the American dollar was equal to 1/10 of an ounce of silver. Then the exchange rate between the British pound and the US dollar would be based on the exchange rate between gold and silver, because they both had the same content weight. They both had the same weight of the metal, but one British pound had gold, the US dollar had silver. So now if gold was $30 an ounce and silver was $2 an ounce, the pound would be worth 15 times more. And so we would have to exchange $15 to get 1 pound because of the value of gold and silver. And obviously, if the proportions were different, like if the British pound was 1/10 of an ounce and the US dollar was 1/20th of an ounce, now we have the weight content being different, and it would take a whole lot more dollars to get a pound. So that's the main thing, the main idea with bimetallism is that the second point, that exchange rates were determined by the relative content and the relative value of the gold and silver. So next is the classical gold standard, went from about 1875 to the First World War. So this is where paper money is fully redeemable for gold. This is an important part of a gold standard, a classical gold standard. You can exchange money at the central bank to get gold. It's typically going to be a fixed, stable exchange rate for gold. For example, $35 an ounce was common back then in the U.S. The exchange rate between two currencies is based on their gold content. So again, very much like what we just talked with bimetallism. Now we're just simply talking about gold. So for instance, if we had 8 pounds was equal to 1 ounce of gold, and 50 yen were equal to 1 ounce of gold, then we just look at the relative exchange rate for those currencies being how much it took to buy an ounce of gold, and we would say 1 pound is equal to 6¼ yen, because that's how much it takes to get the same content of gold. Those two would be equivalent. The gold standard era is largely characterized by stable exchange rates around the world, and so one of the outcomes of that is it makes for trading to be very good. Economic exchange between countries becomes easier. It's very transparent. Everybody knows what's going to happen because we have a stable exchange rate, and it encourages trade. So that's one of the nice things about the gold standard. But there's this big problem. If the gold supply grows slower than the world economy, prices are going to be forced to go down. And so that turns into deflation. That's basically the definition of deflation. And that's never a good situation to be in from an economic standpoint, because what it does is it encourages participants in the economy to kind of sit back and wait for their money to buy more. And so you can have this drag on economic activity in the extreme. People will not do anything because tomorrow their dollars, their currency will buy more stuff. So let's wait till tomorrow, and you can have this kind of negative death spiral where nobody really engages in exchange, nobody really engages in business unless they have to, and you have a big downward pressure on economic activity, economic growth. So the next regime is the interwar period between World War I and World War II. So because of war, the shipment of gold was suspended, along with the redemption of notes. So we had this period where the adjustment mechanisms didn't work and the rules weren't followed, and we had a little bit, we had or didn't have the stability that the gold standard brought between international trade or for international trade. And you throw in the disruption of war, and we have this kind of interlull. That was followed by the Bretton Woods system, where the International Monetary Fund was created. So it was one of the good outcomes of the Bretton Woods system. And this provided for rules for conduct of international monetary policy. And one of the big things was that the IMF would aid or assist less developed countries, help them with their economic development, give them tools to help their exchange, international exchange, buying and selling goods in the international system. Also, the World Bank was created, and that its purpose was to facilitate economic development and post-war recovery. And both of these organizations actually continue to today. They're both kind of involved in assisting less developed countries to to be more fully integrated into the global economy. One key aspect here is the desire to get a stable environment so free trade can happen and avoid currency manipulation for nationalistic goals. So one of the ideas that we'll probably get into more is the fact that you can, as a nation, change your currency, affect the value of your currency. And if you depreciate your currency, it makes all of your goods cheaper in relation to other countries. And so you can engage in kind of a trade war type of a thing where you change your currency to get a bigger share, grab a bigger share of international trade. And so what can happen is if we have a trade war, other countries can engage in those same kind of tactics. They can depreciate their currency, and we have this kind of race to the bottom in terms of currencies, and it disrupts global trade. It makes global trade trickier, harder to engage in, less transparent, more risky for participants, and so the whole notion of having a stable environment is going to be good for global trade. And lastly, the notion of foreign exchange reserves, where we could have special drawing rights, which is a basket of currencies that was created with the IMF. It makes trading easier. You don't have to necessarily have the same currencies as your trading partners. If you have this basket of currencies called the special drawing rights, they're called SDRs, and it represents a trade-weighted basket of currencies. So there's going to be a portion of dollars, a portion of yen, a portion of euros, a portion of Chinese yuan that are in there. And that facilitates trade. So you don't have to, again, these special drawing rights, you can pay for goods and services with those SDRs. Then finally is flexible exchange rate regime, which we're in today. This is basically where the market determines exchange rates. It's not determined by gold or hopefully by central government activities. We just let the market determine what that's going to be. Central bank intervention is allowed to help control volatility, but it's not really a desire for the central bank to drive the exchange rate to a certain level. So intervening in the market to determine the rates as opposed to helping to control volatility. Less volatility is always good for trade, but to the extent that central banks are picking a rate and pushing it for kind of nationalistic goals, that would not be desirable. Then finally, gold was officially abandoned as a reserve asset. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we'll pick up with video 2 and hopefully wrap up the regime, international monetary regime chapter, and I'll see you then.